Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming so much. I really appreciate it. I work as a graphic designer at Partners in Design in Seattle, but I'm also a writer and an educator. And when I received the 2012 Astra Zarina Fellowship, what I wanted to do was having the ability to spend 2 months in one place working and studying in Civita de Bagnoregio was a huge just gift. As you've just heard, it's a hill town that has a history that goes back 3,000 years to the Etruscans. So as a designer, first and foremost, what I do is organize information and try to make sense of things that are sometimes very dissimilar. But I'm also a storyteller. And so this dual persona was something that I really wanted to bring to the project when I received the fellowship. Which was to create a series of maps that, in my mind, were storytelling maps that would make sense, personal sense, of a very special place. Both my writing and my design, I think I could say, are grounded in the concept of literacy. And by that, I mean the ability to look at the visual thinking of the past and apply it to either design or words or stories and interpret it within the context of today. Now, this is probably as good a time as any to say that I am not an architect and I am not a historian and I have a lot of content in these maps that there are probably lots of errors, which I take full responsibility for. So why maps, as a designer? Like, why not brochures or posters? For designers, and I think I can extend this to the general public, maps are a primary method of making sense of a place. And I think we put a lot of trust in them. So adding to that layer of trust, I felt like I had a grounding. There was a grounding that people were going to be able to enter into these maps on a certain level already, and then I could sort of tweak along the way. Traditional maps are essentially just arbitrary bits of information. But yet, as users, we really assign a lot of trust to them. The problem, I think sometimes, as probably many of you know, as visual people, is that they don't earn our trust. And many times, they're just complex layers of information that if you're not the kind of person who responds to that data, you're sort of lost. You're lost. What I wanted to do was to see if I could make maps that were accessible to people who had never been in this new place, and yet at the same time also layer on an emotional component, because any of you who have been to Civita know that it's just like such an amazing place. And it's one of the hardest places, I think, to convey to other people who haven't been there what it's like. So, in traditional societies, I think there was no need for maps, just like there was no need for many societies to write down their stories, because it was just passed from person to person, culture to culture, But we here, have a need somehow to make a mark on a place. You'll see that with little kids, like right away. The first thing they kind of want to do when they're somewhere is like, draw a line in the sand or do something. So this was something that I kind of wanted to make my mark on Civita by what I observed and interpreted. Again, it's a very particular kind of place, but it's also many different places to many different people. And trying to capture that was sort of primary. Exploring on foot will get you to a particular place. But when you're exploring with your mind or cognitively, that was my route to try to add this extra layer of information. Edward Tufte, who some of you may know, he's a statistics and data professor emeritus at Yale. He is noted for his writings on visual information and data display. two books that he's written are sort of like the must-reads for graphic designers, which is The Quantitative Display of Information and Envisioning Information. This one is his most recent book, Beautiful Evidence, which sets out to sort of explode the idea that data or any kind of visual information has a preconceived idea of what it needs to be, which is not all that dissimilar from the form follows function in architecture. His thesis is that the data doesn't care what you do to it, as long as it works. You know, link it to the content, just make it work. He writes in the book, a colleague of Galileo noted that the astronomer's 38 hand-drawn images of sunspots delight both by the wonder of the spectacle and the accuracy of expression. This is just one of them. Science and art both have in common intense seeing, the wide-eyed observing that generates empirical information. That is beautiful evidence, seeing turned into showing. That, by the way, was the Etruscan liver, which, the Etruscans, first of all, they would be just on their own enough of a reason to go to Civita. Okay, so how do we do this? So typically, I think, we find there are two important things that we do when we try to make sense of a new place. First, we simplify, and we look for patterns where we can find them, moving generally along very basic routes. Typically, we might find a main street and keep the street as the guideline. If we go off on different angles, I think our mind doesn't really process that. We just straighten it out so that if we were going to explain to someone later how to get somewhere, we don't really include those little twists and turns. The second thing we do is we attach meaning along the way and emotions to what we're seeing to make that sort of visual, cognitive sort of impression in our mind. So you probably all have had that experience of particularly traveling, asking for directions or getting into a conversation with someone, and then the next thing they've told you how to go somewhere, but along the way they've also told you that, oh, and that's the church where my daughter got married, and along the way just make sure that you look for these other two restaurants because they're my favorite restaurants. And so by the time you actually take the route, you're invested in the emotional experience because you've been given this extra layer of meaning. So to demonstrate this is my interactive component, by the way, which I need to, I'd like you to try creating a visual cognitive map of your own. Okay, right now. First I'm going to show you a series of hand-drawn maps, just like 5 or 6 of them. Some of which I want to acknowledge are from students from Cornish, 2 of my colleagues who taught at Cornish with me. So some are from students from Cornish College of the Arts. Others are from this great association called the Hand Drawn Map Association. I don't know if you know of it, but if you don't, you should check it out. It's really great. So just take a look at these as I go through them and just sort of get something from them that, whether emotional or content-wise, okay? That one. Okay, now I'd like you to close your eyes. I'm not going to ask you to actually draw the map. I want you to visualize it, okay? I want you to close your eyes, and for 1 minute, which is a long time when you're actually doing something for a minute, recreate in your mind a visual map of the route that you took this morning from your home or your office to this event. Pretend that you need to hand it off to someone, okay, visually. Tell them how to get here. So you might add something along, like symbols along the way or landmarks, whatever you like. But before you start visualizing, because I know you're all visual people, begin by simply thinking back to your route and the morning and what it felt like and what you needed to do. Okay. Now, when you think back, you can open your eyes. Now, when you think back to what you visualize, of course, everyone's map is going to be different. But what I'd like to do is ask you to just call this out. Like, I want you to tell me if there was anything other than content or style that entered into your visual cognitive mind map.
School crossing guard.
Okay? Just anything else. When the sun came out. Okay. So, you know, from something concrete to, again, something a little bit more abstract or...
This teacup.
Okay. So an event or an action or something.
Olympic mountains.
Ah, okay. Olympic mountains again. So what do I mean by some of those examples? What do I mean by going beyond style and content? Does anybody want to suggest what I'm trying to get at by that?
Experience.
Yeah, experience and emotion, connection, some meaning that you know. So let's just say, you know, I mean, if you're like most people, your mind processes the visual mind map in a way that is very personal. So, you know, maybe you were really busy. Or in fact, I know someone was really busy and was stuck in traffic and was like starting to panic, like, can I get here on time? So that visual, you know, cognitive map is going to be different from what she layered on for the experience versus somebody who maybe took the morning off, walked the dog, came from Capitol Hill, you know. So what I think, whatever the scenario, it's a good bet that there was some emotion or feeling that entered it. It's not just, you know, texture, style, line weight, whatever. And those maps, I think, demonstrated that as well. So what did you do? You made choices, right? You made choices, and designers are always making choices. What to leave in, what to take out. Everything kind of goes through this surgery, this cartographic surgery. Now, fortunately, as designers, maps, again, we've said, are something that we're also familiar with, that we have an advantage as the designer of the map that we can take those liberties because everybody kind of knows the method. But I think it's really, for me, it was really interesting to acknowledge that to map is really to lie because there's a bias. There's always a bias, literally and figuratively. You're deciding what to put in, what to leave out, how to present that information. So Oscar Wilde said, every portrait that's painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not his sitter. Okay. So for my project, how this applied was that, you know, it just was going to add to the character of the maps in my mind. It wasn't going to diminish from it at all. Okay. Does anybody, you don't have questions. Anyone have questions? Okay. I have to ask if there's student questions. Okay. This is, I'd like to follow up, I guess, a little bit on Jim's history lesson of Civita. This is actually the last map that I created after my 2-month fellowship, but it makes sense to be the first one that I show you because it is, as designers know, exhibit designers know, timelines are the staple of exhibit design because you've got a huge body of information that you need to condense into a very, you know, short form. So this is an interactive Prezi that I created that gives you sort of a time map of Civita di Bagnoregio within the context of what you're going to be seeing afterward. And it's just like 3 or 4 minutes. So I'm just going to run it.
And advance it.
that enormous amount of 3,000-year history, that the challenge in Civita for me became not what to map, but how I was going to put this all together in some kind of cohesive way, that all the connections and intersections. But like any good city, Civita was an example of coexisting contrasts. You know, a 13th century church next to an Etruscan column fragment, across the streets from a Renaissance palazzo, you know, diagonal from a 21st century tourist shop. So the results were going to be different. I knew this at the outset, depending on how I combined them. But I needed organizing principles. So I looked to just the normal ones that I think not just designers, but just we as people use when we try and encounter something new. So we discover new things, and we record them. We navigate our way through different experiences. We try to describe what we've seen. We document, we preserve. So these sort of became my mapping criteria. And by keeping Tufte's advice in mind, I was trying to let the content lead the way, but I set out to link one of the content through also expressing one of these experiences. You're going to see in some of these examples that I've often mapped very disparate elements together, partly because of just using a better use of the space, but also to try to emphasize the fact that I was making arbitrary selections and that they could have been combined in any other way and would have been just as valid. Okay, so I started with discovering the ancient Romans had actually quite advanced architectural elements, and they were known to have used like single, double, sliding, and folding doors. In fact, the Roman god Janus is the god of doors and doorways, which makes him, of course, and I love this, the god of beginnings and endings. So I began my discovery process with doors. Metaphorically, for visitors in any contents, doors are going to hold special significance. So as I worked my way through some of the material in the Italian Hill Towns program housed in the Civita Institute, it was clear that I was not the only one interested in doors, because there were books and books and books of these kinds of drawings by students. But the noticeable difference, of course, was that the student projects would document architectural styles, details, age, construction materials, location. My interests lay, this was really useful to me, but my interest lay more along the lines of the enormous variety of doors in Civita, because every single one seemed to have its own story, and with it, it just symbolized so much. Transition being the other metaphorical element. So at a simplest level, a doorway represents movement from one place to another, but in religion, mythology, literature, it also depicts passage from one world to another, or a deeper personal meaning when you're in a new culture and you're an outsider meeting insiders. I mean, we've all had the memory of, walking into a room and not knowing anyone, and being the only person who, is not sort of, talking and laughing. So taking that step across the doorway was something that means more when you're in a foreign country, I think. Crossing a boundary. It might be someplace where two cultures meet, two experiences meet. These felt really real to me when I was there because, again, I was in a new place. And so they became very much mapping material for me. This is the first result of that map, which I think you can see I tried to evoke within even just the composition of it, insider, outsider, and just the variety of all the doors, public and private. Mapping locations are also located on the map. So one of the goals I really had was to also make these useful. So these do offer architectural style and details, probably with errors. There's also, I have a print set of all of these that you're welcome to look at the conclusion of this presentation. So Robert Louis Stevenson in 1883 published a fictional tale of adventure about an expedition to an unnamed Caribbean island to recover a treasure that had been buried there. Treasure Island. It's one of the first books for young adults that does not have a moral. It's also action-packed. It has a huge cast of characters, and it begins with a map. And as I read about this book, ever since its publication, even when people are told that there is no Treasure Island, people ask, where is Treasure Island? And so it's one of those things that I think was just this really wonderful thing about maps, that they're guides and we trust them, and we want, to make a story about this real, even when it's unreal. They can make unreal places seem real. They can make real places more manageable. Again, anyone who's been in Civita de Bagnoregio, you'll understand that for many reasons it's very easy to feel like this is an unreal place, because the backstory is so deep and the history is so rich that it's almost hard to comprehend that you could be, you get out of your apartment, you walk 20 feet, and you're in front of an Etruscan column fragment that is 3,000 years old. So once the twin cities of Civita and Bagnoregio were one city. They were a single city, along with the merchant neighborhood in the center, swallowed up over the centuries by landslides, and now connected just by a narrow footbridge. Very few maps unite them, again. But when you've spent time there, you can see that one depends on the other. It quickly, living there, becomes clear that Civita is why the tourists come, Bagnoregio exists to serve the tourists. But it also has a day-to-day life, the city. And it can be very easy to overlook the people who are actually there to work. We've all spent time and we've noticed the tourists come to town, they snap a few pictures, they leave after an hour, and that's it. So the little attention that's paid to the day-to-day life for the real people there, like merchants, masons, carpenters, seismic workers, I wanted to notice. I wanted to somehow connect those two. So I decided to create a treasure map, which I knew I wanted to unite Civita and Bagnoregio again. And I also wanted to include not just historic and natural treasures, which are numerous, but everyday treasures. Because when you're traveling, those are very important as well. So it includes places like, the best ATM that wouldn't reject my card, or the best place for like affogato, the best cafe that we discovered. But can strangers use this map to navigate? Yes, they can, because all the information about historic, architectural, and natural wonders is also there. In the end, a treasure map, the design of this one was meant to be casual and fun and sort of evoke that quality. Because eventually the places that we really put on our own treasure maps of our lives are going to be personal. So that was. Okay, symbolizing. Andy and Lana Wachowski are best known for writing the Matrix trilogy. But when I was there, for some reason, I was trying to connect to the intermittent Wi-Fi, and I came upon a New Yorker article about them. Maybe the last trilogy had come out or something, and it talked about how they were great movie fans, big movie fans. And both of them said that 2001: A Space Odyssey was like what made them want to become filmmakers. So here I am in this like tiny room, with the lightning crashing above, reading this article. And 12-year-old Lana says in the article, she was perplexed by the mysterious presence of the black monolith at first that's made her hate the movie, until her father explained simply, "Oh, it's just a symbol." And the article recounts her reaction. "That one sentence went into my brain and rearranged things in such an unbelievable way that I don't think I've been the same since. It's one of the reasons I'm a filmmaker." Now, I don't think every 12-year-old child would respond to symbols that way, but I think partly we don't encourage that sort of visual thinking as a culture. But I guess the anecdote really resonated with me when I was there in Civita, because I was struck by the complex layering of symbol and iconography that was there. And this may be the case in a lot of European countries that histories extend back beyond 1700, but it felt very close to the surface in Civita. So as designers know, symbols have a huge advantage because we don't need to talk about all the backstory. They speak a universal language. I don't need to know Arabic to know that the Kaaba is a symbol relevant to the Muslims, or that the cross is symbolically important to Christianity. I might not be able to articulate all of the subtleties of what the symbol means, but I understand that it's a core concept to these religions. Once a set of symbols passes into the subconscious, it becomes what is called an archetype, or a set of iconography, which really works much like a roadmap, guiding people towards certain behaviors that they may not have necessarily taken that path before. So for example, that's why people, I think, tend to want to pray in a church when they could just as easily pray in their kitchen, right? Or meditate in a particular space that's set up to be contemplative, to encourage that kind of behavior, rather than just doing it at home. So it was almost a foregone conclusion when I arrived in Civita that I knew I was going to do an iconographic map. So it's probably one of the more traditional looking maps. But even here, you'll see that I sort of conflated the three distinct layers that I divided the symbols into, which would be historic, religious, and vernacular. So again, a little history. The Etruscans, the city's first inhabitants, and the Romans who followed were both cultures that really understood well the power of symbols and used them extensively for, birth and rituals and death rituals, fertility. In fact, one of the first things that the Romans did on their relentless march to eliminate the Etruscans was to smash the black clayware that they had, which was heavily decorated with symbols. Iconography was an integral part of Christian life, and in Italy, it survived despite the iconoclasts in the 7th and 8th centuries. So for a palatable look at this mix of iconography, you don't really need in Civita to look much further than the main church, which is the Chiesa San Donato. Because in tangible ways, you can see not only the layering of symbols, but symbol borrowing. So for example, rosettes, which many scholars believe derive from the Etruscan mundus, which was the center to the spiritual world, are abound. Roman sarcophagi, frieze fragments, and corbels are set into the lower outer walls of the church. The theory being sometimes they were just handy pieces of, extra material that the people needed, so they sort of stuck them in. But then, who knows? It could also have been some other reason. That's on the bell tower. And of course, in Italy, the ever-present Madonna. She's everywhere. And going back even further, the physical division of the four contradas, the sections of the city of Civita, they do correspond to the old Etruscan layout of the ideal city, which divides it into favorable and unfavorable zones. So this iconographic map is sort of an amalgam of past incarnations of history, religion, and everyday life. Along with it, I've mapped some of the really beautiful palimpsests, I think, that exist in the town. And it's unified by just a map of the tufo, which in Civita, of course, is the constant. Okay. Preserving. I knew that I wanted to pay tribute to some of the most important figures in Civita, and I knew that NIAUSI kind of wanted me to do that as well, because I was there to document. So Astra Zarina, who you've heard of, who established the University of Washington's Hilltown program, handled restoration projects. It was impossible to avoid, and possibly inauspicious, ecclesiastical associations. So Bonaventura, Civita's most famous son, chapels and statues to him seem to be on every corner, not only of Civita, but Bagnoregio as well. So what better way then to pay tribute to them than to map the two connecting and overlapping trajectories of their lives. This map especially is not meant to be definitive, but it does, talk about sort of the importance of this particular place to two lives and one place. So Bonaventura was born in 1221 AD in a house no more than 20 meters from the Palazzo Alamanni, where Zarina taught her continuity and change programs for 30 years. They both traveled widely, but they both reliably returned to town. And when she died, she was buried in Bagnoregio, not very far from a church where in 1490, Bonaventura's right arm was placed in a reliquary made from gold and silver donated by the people of the town. And that event is celebrated in Civita and Bagnoregio every year on March 14th, today. Part of the beauty of spending an extended amount of time in one place, especially for me, was having the time and the luxury to observe without rushing, having just that time to spend to see the sort of ebb and flow of the town. Writers and artists all love details, but it's always kind of a push and pull between like, what are we going to include, what are we going to leave out, how are we going to sort of document this incredible mix. There was no shortage. We could see, all of us could see from the archives, there was no shortage of real documentation. The entire town had been studied and photographed and inventoried and, over so many decades. But, documentation was part of why I was there. But what about the rest? I kept thinking, what about the rest? There's just like, what about the passing of just one day in the city? That anything that happens doesn't really mean anything in the end of, grand scheme of things. But does that mean that it's not important? Does that mean that it shouldn't be recorded? And my suspicion was that there was going to be something that came out of this that would be interesting. And in Italy, I think that's encouraged. The Italians have a great expression, il dolce far niente, which means the sweetness of doing nothing. And the gift of 2 months, plus the fact of the contrast to the fact of how we run our lives, the internet-driven, like cell phone connected, everything being so busy, busy, busy. We sometimes just think doing nothing is invaluable, or even worse, useless. So how could I try to capture this? What I did was for 2 6-hour periods, on 2 separate days, I sat in the Piazza San Donato and watched what was happening around me. And I recorded everything I could see or hear. And the simple act of needing to look and write was enough at the beginning to try to occupy me. But after a while, something shifted. There was something that happened that I started, it's really hard to explain now, but it was more like moving into like a meditative state. And I started to make connections between what I was seeing, or I imagined that I made those connections. They might not have even been real. I'd like to read you a short portion of what's described on this map, which is a map of 12 hours, which I have printed some quick and easy copies that you're welcome to take to read the whole thing. This section is from 10 a.m. on September 30th, 2012, at a table outside Da Papone's bar. The weather is warm and muggy with scattered clouds. 2 older women pass by. They could be sisters. Same glasses, hair, scarves. One is using a cane. They seem confused. The man in the red sweater is back in his spot in front of the church, this time near the far right door, which is closed. 4 people are suddenly right in front of my table, cameras raised. Where did they come from? REM's Losing My Religion is playing inside Da Papone's. The sun has gone back behind the clouds. A pack of cyclists, all men, all wearing branded Italian jerseys, ride past me on the cobbled street that rings the piazza. Only one bumps his bike down to ride in the graveled area. 6 women, all with Orvieto water bottles, leave Latona souvenir shop and cross the piazza towards me. 3 of them stop to examine the bottom of their shoes. Madonna, Madonna, they repeat to each other. Anna comes out of Da Papone's, checking to see if there is anyone to serve. There is not, and she goes back in. A pigeon flies into the open window at Latona. Another is on the roof of Antico Forno. A man crossing the piazza stops to hug his wife. She carries a set of keys and is smoking. They smile and laugh. I hear, "Where should we eat?" in English for the first time this morning. The bell tower chimes twice. Father Stefano arrives at the church, dressed in black and carrying 2 black bags. The calico cat crosses the piazza diagonally, followed by the Japanese man and his photographer girlfriend. They're laughing. Father Stefano is putting the new October Mass schedule in the display board. The man in the red sweater is suddenly at his side, talking, and I realize now that he is the sacristan that I met when I was visiting inside the church last week with Liza and Craig. A man dressed all in black heads towards the bridge, carrying a dented, silver, hard suitcase. A tabby skitters past me, followed by the calico. 2 men walk past my table. I smell their cigarettes. Sound of clinking dishes. Anna must have customers, but I didn't see anyone go in. Is she cleaning? One of the Americans rests his black backpack on the Etruscan column, just as the bell tower chimes 11 times. Okay, now from public to private. During my stay in Civita, I was looking for a way to convey the mix of what I was hearing, and also pair it with a way to think about how people experience this place. When I first arrived, it was really hot, like in the high 90s. And during the Italian pausa between 1 and 4, it was a relief to everyone to just go inside. And our building had an open doorway that passed onto the main strada. The heat did not keep the tourists inside. From the studio where I was working, I could hear them passing, okay? Mostly Italian, some English, of course I recognized, smattering of German, French, and what I think was Japanese. The words drifted into my room like a cloud. So, word clouds. It just, it was like, okay, word clouds. They became all the rage in the late 90s as a feature of early personal websites and blogs. The visual form was used mainly to visualize the frequency of words and to describe the content and as a navigation aid. And before long, they were being used for things like presidential debate, analysis, and biblical passages. But what I realized was that the basic idea was not that different than a map. And it could be argued that a traditional map really was the first word cloud because the size of the name and the type or feature represented relative to its importance or its population. So how could I capture this data? I tracked the words that I could hear outside my studio window for 1 hour every day, from August 25th to October 25th, when most sensible people were inside cooking or resting. And I designed the results as a calogram, which is visually, if you know, it's a typographic arrangement of the type to mimic the actual physical place. So this is Civita. And it's, of course, very subjective. English jumped out at me without my having any say in the matter, of course. And, the rest was dependent on my limited Italian, college-level French, zero understanding of any Asian language. It's a bit biased, but since there were more Italian tourists in Civita than almost anyone else, I think it kind of reflected a hometown advantage. Okay, finally, we come to what is probably the most subjective mapping criteria that I employed for the series, which was imagining. So it's been said that you can read a person's temperament by looking at their face, speculating how hard or easy their life has been by just looking at the lines. And, I thought, what if the essence of a city were like that? What if we could put aside the statistics and the facts, and what if the character of the city was somehow reflected in the way that the city is actually, its hills, its valleys, its tunnels, its caves, changes in how it moves from public to private. Could we read the sort of city by examining its psychogeography? So I knew I wanted to make one last map that was going to capture something that was more ephemeral, something more of the essence of what I felt like this place was like. As luck would have it, when you have time and you have that gift of time and you're wandering, I wandered into Tony's library And I came upon this volume, this small volume. He had like such an eclectic set of books, and they were all organized like, with labels. And it included a profile of someone I had never heard of called Luigi Ferrarese, an Italian physician and a leading proponent of the 19th century pseudoscience of phrenology, the study of the shape and size of a cranium as a supposed indicator of character and mental abilities, which in America, I guess the theory was expounded by an Italian emigre called Lorenzo Fowler, who created this head that I'm sure you've seen, sort of iconic head. 27 distinct faculties or sub-faculties control certain character traits or intellectual attributes such as cautiousness, benevolence, destructiveness, love of animals, tune, continuity, change. It was great. The connections it seemed to work. So phrenologists worked by touch. They could read a person's character by running the palm of their hands over the surface of the skull. And the relative size of each area corresponded to this power. So I decided to do a Civita phrenologically map. It was, the polar opposite of spending time in a place versus checking it out on Google Maps or just, coming into town for a few days. But after being there for 2 months, I actually found it quite easy to apply some of these faculties. And by shifting the axis of the city, it resembled a head. How fortunate. So here's a little tour. Again, somewhat you need to know the city to do this, but Civita's rich yet destructive past has left its mark, but it remains an industrious city that loves children, families, and animals, and delights in showing its wonders to the world. The city reconstructs more than it builds new, and it's an optimistic place that venerates its past, full of order, wonder, and form. Some of the more colorful stories we heard led to some of the other applications. Time resides in the house where Maria has lived for over 80 years. Human nature extends up the west perimeter, encompassing her garden, where taking in the view requires a payment of €1, which is understandable since human nature must find a way to make a living. Love of sex dwells in what remains of the home of the legendary Milanese Marchesa above the Porta Santa Maria. And continuity and individuality is, of course, housed in the Civita Institute buildings. So, which Civita is the real one? The likely answer is one that doesn't exist in what you've seen. Because creating the sense of place goes well beyond mapping just the physical environment. And wayfinding, whether it's virtual or actual, if it's done well, it allows you to envision new worlds and also leaves room for the users and the viewers to sort of make their own additions or changes. The process was implicit in Civita. I could do this project almost with my eyes closed in this place, but I think it could be done elsewhere. And in Latin, Civita simply means city. So my hope is that this project inspires you to create your own Civita Immaginata, to look at any of the places closer to home that might be special to you and to imagine the many very different ways that they connect and interconnect. Thank you.